not only did the GDP growth over about 15 years in the UK add practically nothing to reported happiness, but in fact the first result of the credit crash in the United States in 2008 was actually an increase in happiness. If you want an explanation of this, quite an interesting explanation, a huge amount of economic activity as recorded by GDP figures is effectively individual rivalrous competition between people, which may actually not contribute much to overall happiness. Great book by Robert Frank called The Darwin Economy, if anybody's interested, which came out about a month or two ago. I have a strange approach to this, which is to suggest, in fact, that advertising is part of the solution to the problem. And I mean that absolutely sincerely, in that intangible value is one form of value you can produce which actually requires no atoms and indeed no scarce resources in its creation. Meaning, or intangible value, or emotional value, added value, whatever you want to call it, isn't actually a scarce resource. In some ways, the pet rock, though derided as one of the sort of worst crimes of marketing excess, the pet rock is actually rather a wonderful thing. It takes something of which there is a great abundance, which is random bits of rock, and attaches emotional value to it. If we could actually do more of that, strangely, we would lead richer lives with actually less stuff. So I know that sounds absolutely bizarre and counterintuitive, and I'm not suggesting that all advertising as currently practiced is the answer. I'm merely suggesting that actually intangible value has a great part to play in solving the problems we've heard about this morning. What I'm specifically talking about is what I call the trifecta, or the sweet spot, and it's simply the emphasis of placing equal, well, not necessarily equal, but actually placing importance on all three areas of potential improvement whenever we attempt to change human behavior, change the planet, change an economy, change a business, change anything for the better. And my great belief is the sweet spot always lies in the middle of those three things. If you look at most academic disciplines now, the really interesting stuff doesn't actually happen within disciplines. It actually mostly happens at the intersection between them. I also give advice to young people. I say, when they say, what should I do? I always say, well, it doesn't really matter what you do, but try and be good or reasonably good at more than one thing. They say, why do you say that? And I said, well, actually, if you try and be really, really great at just one thing, there'll always be 15 people in the world who are better at it than you. But if you combine two slightly eccentric things, you might actually be better than anybody else. It's simple statistics. But this is what I call the sweet spot in between those three. The most interesting areas of progress, actually the most interesting businesses in many cases, arise because someone's got all those three things in alignment. They have an interesting insight into the possibilities of all three. Now, where I think things go wrong is when you have a very, very dominant engineering culture. Now, one of the problems of engineers who are rather like economists, in that what both engineers and economists suffer from, I'll actually be more candid than the previous speaker in this, is not only selfishness in the part of economists, and this is absolutely proven, by the way. When you give them certain mind games to play, they will actually play it to a kind of Nash equilibrium, whereas everybody else is principally motivated by a sense of justice and fairness. Economists are not. Trained economists fundamentally act in a more selfish and unpleasant way than anybody else. Engineers are also similar to economists in that they both suffer from, a slightly unfortunate disease which you could call physics envy. That they're desperate to find models of the world where actually everything, whether it be climate or human behavior, conforms to neat mathematical models, because it's actually by the publication of neat mathematical models that you actually gain advancement as an economist or an engineer. Karl Popper spoke of the world as consisting of a spectrum between clouds and clocks. Things like clouds, meteorology, human behavior, etc., are those things which are highly complex systems, which don't generally behave in linear ways, and which are often react in counterintuitive and unexpected ways. Clocks, at the other extreme, are those things which most actually obey simple, codifiable rules of physics. And Popper's observation was the worst mistakes that are made in the world are made when we treat clouds as if they're clocks. We try and treat clouds, whether it be human behavior, something uncertain and complicated to predict, as though it were a kind of simple physical equation. And I think we see this Particularly, I'm a violent opponent of some manifestations of high-speed rail, because it seems to me the application of mathematical certainty to human pleasure. Since they spent $6 billion making the trains faster between Paris and London, there have actually been a large number of complaints, because people said they preferred the rail journey when it was a bit longer. You had a chance to sit down. It's a typical dumb GDP engineering plus economist assumption that the only way to improve a journey is to make its duration shorter. It's fundamentally Philistine as well. As I made the point, for 0.1% of that budget, you could have put Wi-Fi on the trains, which would have actually made the journey useful rather than pointless if you're a business person. I made a more outrageous suggestion, which was actually you could take £1 billion, employ all of the world's top male and female supermodels, get them to walk up and down the train serving out free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers. You would then be left with £5 billion in change, and people would ask for the trains to be slowed down. But it's a fundamental engineering assumption that you must have a numerical measure, and reducing that measure therefore improves something. Indeed it does, by the way. If the journey took 8 hours and you could get it down to 3, I think most of us would agree that's an improvement. But however, if you look at human psychology, we don't actually enjoy things in a linear way like that. One of the annoying things about short-haul air travel is that actually, after all the grief of getting on the plane, the amount of time you spend sitting down on the plane is sometimes annoyingly short by comparison. Journeys can be too short as well as too long. And no one is asking those fundamental questions in this case. They simply pursue a simple linear metric, which is faster equals better. I don't buy that at all. I think there are 100 ways you can improve a journey which have absolutely nothing to do with speed. The other argument I'd make is that if you look at the last train journey you made, everything was bloody annoying. Getting to the station, parking, buying a ticket, finding the right platform, getting your luggage onto the train, except the train journey itself, which was actually quite enjoyable. So why are we spending all the money improving the one component of a journey which isn't crap? Now, blame engineers, blame economists, blame physics envy. Where you look at something which can actually look at all three, it takes psychology as well as technology as well as economics into account, is, for example, an interesting debate about how you get people in Britain to turn up to appointments with a GP or indeed with a consultant. Someone spotted that an enormous amount of money is wasted because people simply don't turn up to visit their GP. Good technological solution, send them a text the day before and the morning of the appointment to remind them. That's not bad. Even better solution, embracing psychology, is make that text a question saying, can we expect you at 9 a.m. and ask them to reply with the letter yes. Why? First of all, behavior actually conforms. If you get someone to reply to a message, they're more likely to actually conform to something they've actually said and sent. It's a kind of affirmation confirmation bias than if they've merely received a message. So that the prior action greatly increases the likelihood of the later action. Some dentists actually adopt the practice now of, rather than giving someone an appointment card with the date of their next appointment filled in, they hand them the card and a pen and get them to write down the date themselves. They find the likelihood that people turn up is much, much greater. If you can get all three working together, particularly the magical technology called the mobile phone, which is, as Stanford University's Professor B.J. Fogg, who is the Professor of Persuasive Technology at the University of Stanford, I think possibly the best job title in the world, as he says, the mobile phone is just a superlative nudging device. If any part of your solution depends on some form of human behavioral change, the mobile phone represents extraordinary potential, as we've seen already this morning. I don't understand why this never happens at hotels. This is technology, it's economics, which is actually, it's 8 o'clock in the evening, we've got 7 suites that are available, it's unlikely 7 people are going to turn up and pay full price. That's good economics. Then the simple bit of psychology there is it's much easier to get people to pay £150 or £200 for a hotel if you get them to do it in 2 stages. Try and sell people a suite up front. It's much harder than if you sell them a room and then a few weeks later upgrade them to a suite. It's a process called chunking. Great man, Robert Crampton. Anybody know him? He was the chief executive of American Airlines. An extraordinarily candid man who once said, I don't invest in airlines. They're a lousy way to make money, but they're a great place to work.
interesting because he invented two things. He invented yield management, which is what we might call sort of JetBlue, EasyJet pricing. Widely varying prices for airline seats according to demand. He also invented the frequent flyer program. So two very interesting things which I think embrace all three things: technology, psychology, and economics. I think yield management is one of the great exciting and unexplored areas of business. And why it fascinates me is, conceivably at least, it seems to be an idea that benefits everybody. That by getting a greater variation of prices, you make certain goods, like train travel or first-class train travel, accessible to a greater number of people. You reduce overcrowding, you make better use of available resources because you spend less time shunting trains around the countryside just carrying fresh air, which was the case until yield management pricing was introduced to the railways. It possibly, and the economics for this are more complicated, it possibly benefits the environment by meaning that at least if a plane's going to take off, it's going to have quite a few people on it. Although there's some complicated other factors working in the other direction, I admit that. Like most really interesting ideas, yield management depends on three things. It depends actually on a really good economic understanding of where potential incremental revenue it comes from. It depends on technology. Actually, it's very difficult to do that airline or railway-based pricing without the internet, simply because a human phone call saying, and how much would it be if I went on Wednesday, would drag on and be unbearably tedious. But with one big screen in which we can compare 15 prices at once, then actually yield management works. It depends on technology, but vitally it also depends on psychology. 30 years ago, you couldn't have introduced it because people fundamentally didn't accept it. 30 or 40 years ago, if you're on a plane sitting next to somebody else, and you discover that they'd paid £40 less for their flight than you had, you blamed the airline. Now you blame yourself. I should have booked earlier. And that's a vital area of psychological progress. And I think quite a lot of the solutions to the problems we've seen addressed earlier this morning will actually come not just through technological progress and not just through economic progress, but through what I call psychological progress. Getting people to accept certain new heuristics and certain new rules of thumb in the way they look at the world. There are certain biases which all people have as a product, in many cases, of a few million years of evolution. One of the worst, I think, being scarcity bias. One of the worst biases is we intrinsically tend to look at things that are rare or in short supply as though they were especially valuable. Rhinoceros horn being an extreme case. Now, that actually is basically an evolved bias. Caviar, to be absolutely honest, tastes like shit. And if the stuff weren't rare and expensive, no one would have the slightest interest in it, to be candid. But because it's rare, we value it. That seems to me to be an extraordinarily bad human heuristic, which the more you can actually do to challenge it, the better we'll be. But there are other ways, I think. We tend to have a huge preference for ownership over collaborative consumption. We are more comfortable buying a second home, which is something we feel we own, than we are, for example, spending far less money renting other people's homes. There are certain inherent biases within the human mind, which if we can somehow find ways to challenge them or get people to rethink them, really make a difference. And what yield management proves is you can challenge those. It used to be that people said, that's not fair, you've paid £50 less than me, and we've both been on the same plane to Budapest. Now people just accept it, because someone came up with a new rule, which is the earlier you book, the less you pay. And so there are a few interesting things. I'm fascinated by the Austrian school of economists, partly because they are incredibly unfashionable among conventional economists. One of the reasons being they refuse to use maths for complicated philosophical reasons of their own, which more or less makes them personae non grata among anywhere else in economics. But they also have a great thing which makes me admire them even more, which is they are obsessively subjectivist. They're the first people to spot that actually value is subjective, and that you can take things which don't cost very much to produce and make them very, very valuable, and you can equally, it's perfectly, that actually how we perceive, there's a huge danger in economics that we tend to make a distinction between what's real value and what's added value or subjective value or intangible value. And von Mises makes a brilliant point, which is an analogy worth remembering when you look at anything. He simply says that If you look at a restaurant, it's impossible to make a sensible distinction between the value that's created by cooking the food and the value that's created by sweeping the floor. One of them creates the food, the other one creates and determines the context and ambience within which the food is consumed. Both of them contribute to overall enjoyment of food, how you perceive the food, and indeed the quality of the food itself. But to treat those two as separate is completely wrong. They're inextricably linked, and to make the distinction is fundamentally wrong. That's a very, very helpful thing to consider, which is in the right framework, nothing is inherently good or bad in many cases. It's simply the framework within which you consume it. And so he also, I think, is an important man because he believed in a science called praxeology, which is the science of human behavior and decision-making. Why this is so important is that the Austrians, for all their faults, and they have some very, very strange foibles, they believed that economics was a subset of psychology. Most economists believe that actually psychology should bow down to economics, and when people deviate from a model, it's the people who are wrong. The Austrians fundamentally believed that there can be no economics except as a subset of understanding human behavior. Now, when you look at human perception, you realize that the way we perceive the entire world is, of itself, even at the most basic perceptual level, very different from how economists would like us to perceive the world. The whole of conventional economics is based on absolute perception, that we have certain perceptions of things which are based on their utility, and we have a kind of, almost as if we had an inner currency called the hedon, which is a unit of pleasure, and we know what a unit of pleasure is and how much we're prepared to pay for it. If you look at how we actually see the world, try this one. There are two squares, A and B. Nobody, I think, disagrees that A is one of the dark squares, B is one of the light squares. However, if I change the context, what you'll see after about 5 seconds is, bizarrely, A and B, I've done nothing else there, are exactly the same color. They're exactly the same shade of gray. But our perception of virtually anything, and that includes pleasure, pain, value, volume, pitch, temperature, virtually all our senses operate at a relative level, not at an absolute level. Now, weirdly, having seen that those two grays are the same, once I change the context back again, it's now impossible for you to see that. This isn't one of those kind of strange optical illusions where you go, ooh, now I get it. It's actually impossible for you actually to see that as though those two grays are the same. That's how we perceive the world. It's fundamentally relativistic. So one of the basic assumptions of economics, which is that we can actually make comparisons of value between different categories of things unaffected by what else is alongside them, is shown to be basically dangerously wrong on that basis. We need comparison in order to decide. One of the arguments I've had with Spotify, I've said, actually giving people infinite music for $9.99 a month may be a terrible mistake. It may be more popular and more valuable if you limited people to 150 tracks a month. And everybody said, well, you're completely bonkers. Why would 150 tracks a month be better than infinite tracks? I said the problem with infinite music is nobody knows what it's worth. It's just too weird a concept. It's like me saying to you, would you like to buy my unicorn? Okay? It's too difficult a thing to put a price on because nobody knows what to compare it to. You say 200 tracks a month, people go, that's about 20 CDs. That would normally cost me about $140. Yeah, actually $9.99 seems a pretty good deal. Estate agents use comparison very cleverly because they know we only choose houses based on their price compared to other houses we've seen that are similar. We have no absolute concept of value and property at all. Now, my view here is that behavioral economics can be used, as well as to sell houses by unscrupulous estate agents. It can also be used to solve some pretty interesting and important problems. One of my theories is this: if you want people to complete a course of antibiotics, so preventing resistant strain of bacteria from appearing, don't give people 24 white pills, give them 18 white pills and 6 blue ones, and tell them, when you finish the white pills, take the 6 blue ones. They're vastly more likely to complete the sequence if it comes in stages. It's the same psychology that gives software a loading bar so you can see some measure of progress. If you have intermediate stages, you're much more likely to get to the end of the process. People like trade-offs. Pick your own strawberries is not the same as cheap strawberries. If you offer strawberries cheap, people tend to think they're of inferior quality and they infer from price something to do with quality. If you make the trade-off explicit, It's one of the reasons why actually low-cost airlines deliberately don't offer you some things, because they want to make very, very explicit where the money is being saved, so you don't infer from the low ticket prices that they're not checking the engines or something. But here's an idea based on yield management. I think there are vastly greater applications for yield management in the world, which are still blocked by psychological problems. And my contention is that actually charities have an interesting role to play. Now, I tried this experiment when I got stuck on the hard shoulder at Heathrow, and I couldn't get to the airport, and I had non-refundable air tickets. And I was just about to miss my plane with my wife and my 2 children, basically ditching a few £1,000s worth of air tickets because I couldn't get to the airport. And I said, wouldn't it be much more sense if you could actually pay £30 to drive on the hard shoulder at about 20 miles an hour? So that people who are absolutely desperate to get somewhere, and most people just don't like the idea. It's not that it isn't a good idea, it's a very good idea economically. It allocates the hard shoulder to those people who want it most, but basically for egalitarian reasons, people hate it. And I understand why. Now, it's no good making the hard shoulder usable by everybody, because then you just create a 4-lane traffic jam, not a 3-lane traffic jam. But if you have an express lane, similarly, when you get to the airport, you have a queue for the security people. Now, some people have a flight leaving in 20 minutes who would gladly pay £5 to get through a separate security lane. Again, the problem with charging £5 for that is everybody suspects then that the airport authority are just creating artificial queues over here to make more money over there. But what if both these things became charitable in nature? Would the level of acceptance go up? So actually, if you need to, if in other words you need to drive on the hard shoulder because you're running desperately late, you can do it, but you have to give £30 to one of 5 recognized charities. If you want to go through the fast lane at the airport, you can do it, but you have to give at least a certain donation to one of 5 recognized charities. Does that change the usual psychological objection so people will actually accept something, whereas they wouldn't accept it if it were purely commercial? The most bizarre thing that mystifies classical economists is seating for concerts. The reason touts can make money is simply because the seats are priced badly in the first place. No economists are completely sure, but they think it's because bands don't like to be seen gouging their fan base by charging immense amounts of money for scarce tickets. So as a result, they charge standard amounts, and the touts make all the money. Could you do it where the more expensive seats or the last 200 seats are the standard price, but you need to make an extra £30 charitable donation in order to sit there? So is there scope for charities like the WWF? What classical economists wouldn't understand is they would argue to a classical economist that £30 is £30 regardless of where it goes. I would argue as a behavioral economist that intentionality really, really matters to people. And there's immense difference between gaining a privilege through generosity and gaining a privilege through wealth. Other things, parking. Every 5th or 10th parking space on a street should actually be 3 times more expensive than the other 9, so that there is always a few parking spaces available for people in a hurry. Again, it's seen as horribly greedy if a council does it. What happens if you just create 1 in 10 charitable parking spaces, and likewise, the last 5 or 10 spaces in a car park should be more expensive than the other 200? Because a car park that fills up is actually useless, in a sense. I see this every day because I go to a car park which does fill up, and you see people with job interviews who can't get onto the train because there's nowhere left for them to park. Those people would happily pay £15 for that one day to a charity in order to park in one of the generous spaces. Just as you have disabled spaces, you should have 5 or 10 spaces for the generous. Now, Coca-Cola, interestingly, tried a yield management model for a vending machine where the price of Coke went up with the temperature. Objection actually forced them to back down. Quite logical in economic terms. In psychological terms, it doesn't work. I would personally favor a yield management scheme which charged retired people a premium for shopping on Saturday and Sunday. I know this is malicious of me, but you turn up at the weekend and you go, you've had all week. What are you doing here now? Similarly, a charitable premium for who gets the empty seats next to them when you're flying in economy. What are the opportunities for teaming up with businesses to really, really raise money in ways where it's too awkward for the business to ask the money, but where a charity reasonably can? The vital thing, I'll finally wrap up, intentionality really matters. we can actually feel differently about two economic transactions which to an economist are identical. There's the huge difference between a choice and a compromise. At the moment, two things which suffer because they're inferior goods. Because we perceive things comparatively, we perceive as a coach as an inferior form of train, and we perceive as a video conference as an inferior form of airline travel. Each of them, if you think about it, video conferencing, we perceive as margarine to British Airways butter. It's the pager to BA's mobile phone. It's what you do when you can't quite be there in person. Inferior goods, in economic terms, always do really, really badly because we think comparatively and we think of them as a crap version of something else. Now, interestingly, George, one of the things is the teleconference, first of all, is a technological disaster. When you book a conference call, it should ring you. It shouldn't demand that you ring in. Secondly, the code should not be 19 digits long. Okay? It should be a word using the alphanumeric things on the keyboard. If you branded a teleconference service WWF and you made the intentionality not about avoiding an airline trip or avoiding a journey, you made it actually high-minded, so this isn't actually a compromise, this is a choice. Can you make money by doing things which a charity can do which a commercial entity can't make work? What value does the charity brand have in enabling you to go into forms of business which actually, if a commercial entity tries to do it, psychologically they simply don't work? And the final example, George Monbiot, the environmentalist in the UK, makes the point that coach travel is by far, per bottom mile, the most ecologically friendly way to transport human beings. Better than trains, better than planes, better than anything else. But it also receives no consideration among senior people because nobody earning more than £15,000 a year has been on a coach in 25 years if they're over the age of 40 and don't live in Oxford. But if as a charity, you could make the coach acceptable, and I have a Panda-branded version for you here, what can a charity do to make a business that is environmentally friendly seem like a question of intent, not a question of compromise? The two are absolutely identical if you're an economist, okay? The technology may be very, very similar, but I refer you as one final thing to Jeremy Bullmore's Dinner Jacket, a great advertising man in the UK, who makes the point that if you turn up at a black tie event in a suit because you can't afford a dinner jacket, that's a compromise and you feel dreadful. If you turn up at a black tie event in a suit because you've got a dinner jacket at home but you can't be bothered to put it on or you object to wearing it, that's a choice and you feel absolutely fine. So the economic product, the food, may be identical, but the actual value we attach to it and the emotional meaning we derive from it, that's the sweeping of the floor, as von Mises would say, is completely different. And charity brands have an extraordinary role to play in the economy in making possible forms of exchange which commercial brands simply can't. I hope. I hope that's an idea worth spreading. Thank you very much indeed.